This is week 5, audio 2. Let's continue with slide 11. The people who were thinking about how to carry out socialization in the countryside, and when I say that, what do I mean? I mean establishing socialism in the countryside, establishing socialism in the cities, socialization in the cities. So the people looking at the countryside who were thinking about that knew their Russian history, and they knew that the Russian Revolution started in the cities, and then the Bolshevik army had to conquer the rest of the country, going from west to east. And it was only in the cities in the west, St. Petersburg, Moscow, and so on, that there was a communist revolution. And then after much infighting, the revolution gradually spread to the east, and it took several years, but eventually the Russian Far East was conquered. And this meant that the peasantry in Russia was not instantly pro-communist. As a matter of fact, they were anti-communist. And if you were to web search on the word kulak, which is in point number 1 here, kulak meant the dominant class of rich peasants in the countryside in Russia, and you also searched in the same click on Stalin, you get a lot of interesting information about that. But that was not how things went in China, because, as you know, if you've been reading and listening, the Chinese Revolution started in the countryside and gradually surrounded the cities. The Chinese Communist Revolution, anyway. So party theorists were concerned that if collectivization was delayed for too long, that class polarization between rich and poor peasants might eventually take place. And indeed, the first stages of socialization of the countryside did not include disenfranchising the rich peasants, and the rich peasants became richer. Partly this is because the communists wanted to preserve and expand on the agricultural production levels of the time. They didn't want to screw things up, in other words, in the countryside. They wanted to make sure that production went up. So at first, they went easy. But then they decided it was time to level things out. And so eventually, collectivization began to take off, partly because Mao Zedong could see that things were stable in the countryside. If things are stable, production is rising, then there might be room to begin to correct the situation and start to form cooperatives. These cooperatives, the 农业合作社, started off in small groups of households, basically small village levels, but eventually they were expanded in the mid-1950s, as you can see in these bullets and as you can read about in our selected readings. They were gradually expanded to include groups of villages. And if you've driven through the American farm country, if you've driven through Nebraska, Illinois, Kansas, and so on, what you find outside of the small towns is a farmhouse surrounded by a lot of land, and of course a mechanized effort. So you've got 50, 100, 200, 500 acres, whatever it is, and one farmhouse in the middle of all that. In China, it's one village in the middle of a bunch of acreage. That's not an unfair characterization. It's a rough one, but it's not unfair. So instead of one farmhouse, one village. And so these APCs, these agricultural producers cooperatives, started off small, one small village, but then included a number of villages. And eventually, during the next phase that followed of the people's communes in the early 1960s and into the Cultural Revolution, the level of accounting for agricultural production, and I'll get to what that means in a second, was raised up to the county level. So an entire county was one unit of accounting at the state, in the eyes of the state. And what on earth does that mean, a unit of accounting? It means that state demands, I can't think of the word, quotas. It meant that the quotas assigned by the state at first in the lower level APCs were assigned to groups of 25 households. Produce this much and you can keep that much and so forth. And then the quota, when we went to the higher level APCs, was 250 families or so. And during the time of the people's cooperatives, the Renmin Gongshe, this level of accounting, an assigned quota by the state, was all the way up at the county level. And this was viewed as an advance in socialization, in other words, bringing socialism to the countryside, because it meant that people were not so much working for themselves. They were working for the group. So maybe you've heard the expression, from each according to his ability, and to each according to his needs. That idea is part of socialist theory. So this high tide of collectivization at the end of 1955 and that went on into 1956 was completely guided by Mao. He was very much in touch and very much in control of all of the policies regarding agriculture, because he was, after all, from a peasant background. He knew what was going on. So he felt very, very confident in personally guiding this policy. So now let's go on and talk about the movement that followed. First, the anti-rightist movement and the Great Leap Forward and so forth. I call it Mao's phony retreat after the Great Leap Forward, because while he supposedly pulled back from the leadership, he never really took his hands out of the pie, but we'll get into the details there. Let's go on to slide 13. So we've already talked about the 100 flowers, and we'll review that in a second. But it's a good idea to note that in the period of the middle 50s, before the 100 flowers even began, problems were beginning to develop in society. There were strikes because of a decline in real wages and the increasing scarcity. Ration coupons were used in China not only during this period, but all the way through to 1992. When I first got to China as a diplomat in 1991, as diplomats, the foreign ministry issued us all with ration coupons. Why? Because if we wanted to buy rice on the market or bread, we had to have a grain coupon to do it. It didn't matter that you were a foreign diplomat, and it wasn't legal to spend hard currency. By law, one had to have a ration coupon in order to buy items that were constrained in the marketplace. In other words, where there wasn't enough to meet demand. That went all the way up to 1992. And so scarcity was a problem of greater proportion back then, in the mid-50s. And there was an increasing bifurcation between the haves and the have-nots, which had Mao upset, and the haves, the people who had resources, increasingly were party members, particularly after the high tide of agricultural cooperatization began to be implemented. Intellectuals in the cities, and by the way, if you were a high school graduate at this time, you were an intellectual. All of you would be intellectuals if you were in China during this period, whether you were a foreigner or whether you were Chinese, because you know how to read. I'll give you another aside here. When I went to China to live briefly in 1985, I had to stop at a police station in Shandong province to ask directions. And to make a long story short, I discovered through asking for directions and asking about the name of a particular place and all that, that none of the policemen in the police station could read. I'm not kidding. 1985, police station in a major city in Shandong province in Jinan, none of them could read. I wanted to look something up, and I wanted their help, and they couldn't do it. It's not that they didn't want to, either. And that's because they were all demobilized soldiers. So there you go. That was the nature of society even in the 1980s. Literacy was not that high, in spite of the communist propaganda of the time. It said that the Communist Party had brought literacy to China. That was just a bunch of baloney. Literacy was raised to some extent from the virtual zero that it was before 1949. However, this was not as successful as is often painted in things that have been written about China. So these people that Mao is talking to in this photograph were capitalists who had been allowed to continue to run their business just like in the countryside. Rich peasants were allowed to continue to farm. Here in the cities where there was industry and so on, capitalists were allowed to continue to operate their businesses even though they were being slowly taken over by the state, slowly bought out, in other words, for much less than they were really worth. And that was to keep production going, to keep the economy moving. Mao didn't like this, but he was being practical by allowing that situation to continue. So let's go on to slide 14. I've made some corrections here. I sort of screwed this up last week, besides not talking about land reform. I also made some mistakes here, so I don't want to go through this in detail because I've already talked about it. I didn't make any mistakes in what I said, but there were some mistakes in the previous slide. So an important part of this was the Hungarian revolt and also the Polish revolt that occurred in late 1956. This made everybody think. It came right after Stalin's secret speech, or Khrushchev's secret speech about the crimes of Stalin, which is referred to in one of our short videos this week. And it occurred because partly because people were very dissatisfied with their lot in Eastern Europe, and they thought, well, now that Stalin's gone, they aren't just going to come in and kill us if we start to protest. And so protests went farther, perhaps, than anybody thought they would. And in China, nobody wanted this. Nobody wanted to have any sort of protest, but there were already some strikes occurring. So Mao Zedong decided it was time to open up matters to some criticism so we can try to make corrections and avoid the mistakes of the Soviets. It didn't work out so well because there was a lot more criticism than Mao anticipated, and he became threatened by that. But before he entered into the crackdown, there was this idea that we should try to identify what sort of things can be discussed and what sort of things shouldn't be discussed. And this was the origin of his speech on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. It was one of his most important speeches of his career, and it's famous because he talks. It's a little bit complicated to read it, even in English, but the basic message was that some people are our enemies, some people are our friends. The disagreements we have with our enemies are antagonistic disagreements. They lead to violence and revolution and war. However, the disagreements we have amongst our friends, our supporters, should not be treated that way. They should be treated in a friendly manner, and we should try to adjust our policies based on that. And this was an idea that was consistent with his idea and other Marxists' ideas of democratic centralism. That is, that the center issues policies to the populace. The populace gives feedback to their representatives who are at the lowest levels. The feedback comes up to the party center. The decision makers at the party center adjust their policies in order to make them realistic and acceptable to the general population. And this dynamic goes back and forth, up and down, in theory. So part of this discussion was about Tibet and Mao's idea that Han chauvinism, that is the Han people, of course, being the people we normally think of as being Chinese. Hanzu in the Chinese language, the Han ethnicity, the Han people. So his idea was that a lot of Chinese are going to Tibet. They can't stand the thin air. The food is horrible. People don't bathe as often as Chinese do. What a yucky place this is, and these people are so backward. We shouldn't listen to anything they have to say. We should just tell them what to do, and they should do it. That's Han chauvinism in a nutshell. And further, his idea was that the Dalai Lama and the Panchen Lama are cooperating with us. If we have disagreements with them, that's fine. We can talk about it. And we have to be careful how we handle Tibet. So that's okay. We can adjust our policies based on this. However, the contradictions among the people turned out to be worse than Mao thought they'd be. Let's go on to slide 16. And this triggered the anti-rightist campaign. In the Tevis reading, you'll notice he says, without footnoting it, that it was incorrect to believe that the 100 Flowers was an evil plot, a trap to draw snakes out of their holes. There's been a lot of discussion about that, and Tevis argues that, and I think he has adequate data to back him up through his earlier studies. Tevis argues that Mao really did want to obtain opinions from society, and he was sincere in doing this all the way through making his speech on the correct handling of contradictions among the people. However, once the stuff started to hit the fan, he became upset. Why did he become upset? Because he expected gentle, sincere criticism. He didn't expect people to start talking about the failures of the Communist Party in detail. He didn't expect people to challenge his dominance of the leadership, and that was going on too. So he came down hard. Beginning in May and June, he started to plan this, and in the late summer, he began this campaign to identify people who had spoken out and criticize them and make them disappear into labor camps. There was not an orgy of executions or anything, but people did get shipped off to camps. And during this time, Mao made a visit to Moscow for the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, which of course was in November. It's called the October Revolution, but it was that was according to the Russian calendar at the time. It was really in November of 1917, so 40 years later. It's November of 1957. Mao is engaged in taking care of those snakes that were lured out of the holes in the anti-rightus campaign, and he goes to Moscow for this anniversary. And while he's there, things don't go very well in the meeting with Khrushchev. However, the Russians are careful not to let things get out of hand, and they reach some key political agreements, including providing the Chinese with a sample atomic bomb. I shouldn't have written nuclear weapon here. I'll have to revise that. It was a sample atomic bomb. So, on his return, Mao is in the mood for change. He considered that the Soviet Union's advances were significant, that the Soviet Union would soon be catching up with the West. It was time for China to start doing the same thing, and he called for these immense increases in agricultural and industrial planning targets. This picture you see here is of some children standing on top of a bunch of bundles of wheat. It was a very famous photograph at the time. The idea here was that we grow our wheat so close together that the children can dance on top of it, and our yields are super high. It was a bunch of baloney, of course. It was completely staged. However, unfortunately, Mao believed this, and other planners believed that this was happening. So the unfortunate dynamic, let's go on to slide 17, that occurred was that the center believed the reports that were coming out of the localities that they were meeting all their targets. And so that meant if you're producing all this grain, why, you should give us your quota according to this tremendous increase in production. That stripped the countryside in most parts of the country of almost all its grain. And so in the summer, or rather in the fall and winter of 1958, there was this enormous surplus of food in the cities. But the countryside was starting to get strangled. It was an unsustainable situation, and it led to a famine the following spring, in the spring of 1959. So the famine started there, and it continued. Once more, agricultural production had been all screwed up because at this point the demand to make steel in the countryside by melting all the pots and pans and then turning it over to the state so that we can use it to make big steel things like buildings, like jet aircraft, was in force. And of course, what people were able to make with these they were called backyard furnaces. What they were able to make with these backyard furnaces was just lumps of useless metal, because not only did they not know how to make steel, but they couldn't make these furnaces hot enough to actually make steel. So what they made was pig iron, and it ended up being useless, and then people don't have pots and pans anymore. Not that they had any food to cook in their pots and pans. It became a very desperate situation. We'll stop here and continue on slide 18.